Welcome to our channel, where we dive into the depths of human emotion, struggle, and redemption. Today we bring you the story of Jessica Bauer, a woman haunted by love, betrayal, and the scars of war. This is a story of survival in a world where nothing is certain, and the past is never truly left behind. Prepare yourself for the Trilogy of Jessica Bauer, The Untold Reckoning. The room was quiet, too quiet. Theo could hear everything. The faint shuffling in the hallway, the hushed whispers leaking from a nearby room, always whispering. The premier had gone mad. Time to flee before the rebellion reached the capital, before they tore down everything he had built. He had no leverage left, no power, and whatever remained of his sanity had slipped away. He was screwed, and he knew it. His fingers drummed a slow rhythm on the desk, the hollow sound reverberating in the still air. It reminded him of his days as a soldier, that comforting cadence of action amidst the silence. He had always been at home in the quiet, in the tension that preceded a storm. But this silence, this was different. This was the silence of defeat. Jessica had left. She had walked out of his life, just like everyone else. There was no gun to his head, no dramatic final confrontation, just the cold reality of abandonment. He could almost feel her absence, as if the air itself had grown colder since she'd gone. His fingers stopped their tapping and he pressed them to his temples, massaging away the pain that throbbed behind his eyes. He closed his eyes, but the memories came unbidden. Her face, pale and fragile, haunted him. The night before, he had barely slept, consumed by doubt and fear. They were supposed to leave for Lakeview in a few days, but something inside him had shifted. Fear had taken hold. Fear that something would happen to Jessie, that Thomas would find them, that everything would fall apart. He dreamt of her often, especially since he'd learned she had been shot. Never trust a Bauer, they'd said. Her pale, blood-soaked face haunted his nightmares. He had woken in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, only to find her lying beside him, her leg brushing against his under the covers. She had looked so peaceful, so untouched by the darkness that consumed him. He couldn't let her stay. He couldn't let her fall victim to his choices. He couldn't lose her the way he had lost everything else. The next day had been torture. He had gone through the motions, avoiding her as much as possible, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. There was only one way to keep her safe, and it was the last thing he wanted to do. But he had to do it. He summoned one of his men and ordered her to his office. He couldn't bear to face her, couldn't bear to look into those wild, defiant eyes and see the hope he was about to crush. When she arrived, he didn't turn to face her. His voice came out harsh, colder than he intended, but he couldn't soften it. "Leave." She froze, confusion flooding her face. "Wait, what? I don't understand." "Go, Jessica, go while you still can." Her eyes widened, and for a moment he saw something in them. Fear, hurt, or maybe something deeper, something he didn't want to name. He couldn't meet her gaze. He focused on the wall, on the cracks in the paint, on anything but her. "I've had enough." His voice faltered, betraying the cracks in his resolve. She had been a bright spot in the darkness that surrounded him. She had given him hope when he thought he had none left. And now, he was pushing her away. He turned toward her, his fingers trembling as he reached for her chin, lifting her face to meet his. "I've done terrible things, Jessica. Things I believed were justified. But what I did to you, I'll never forgive myself." His voice was raw, the truth spilling out despite his efforts to hold it back. She looked at him, her eyes wide, her lips parted in shock. Anger simmered beneath the surface, and he could feel it building. That fire in her had always been there, always burning just beneath the surface. He wanted her to hate him. It would be easier if she did. He stepped back, crossing his arms over his chest to stop himself from reaching for her again. Disgust coursed through him. He had taken advantage of her, used her, manipulated her. And now, as she stood before him, he realized just how far he had fallen. He was no better than the men he despised, no better than the ones who had used him. He turned back to the desk, grabbing the passport and the map he had prepared for her. "Here, my men know I'm releasing you. Thomas and the rest of your family are waiting. Just go to them." Her voice was small, hesitant. "Did I do something wrong?" "No!" he snapped. "But didn't you want to leave from the moment you arrived?" She didn't answer at first, her eyes dropping to the map in his hands, her brow furrowed, and he could see the fierce determination return. The girl who had torn through his defenses was still there, stronger than ever. She looked up at him, defiance burning in her gaze. "Is this a trap?" Her raspy voice pulled at something deep inside him, something he tried to ignore. He would miss that voice, miss the fire in her. "It's over, Jessica. Not the elective. That's safe. I have a plan for that. But for what? There's nothing left here. Nothing for you. Nothing for me." "Thank you." Her voice was clearer now, almost steady. She even smiled, though it was faint and tinged with sadness. "Go to the Master of Arms," he said, his voice tight. "He has orders to give you weapons." She nodded and turned to leave, but as her hand rested on the door, she paused. She looked back at him one last time, her eyes searching his face. He forced himself to remain still, to keep his expression blank. She didn't need to know. She didn't need to see how close he was to breaking. "Thanks," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "And not just for this. You saved me in more ways than one. I hope we'll see each other again." He shook his head, his voice rough. "Better we don't." He hadn't meant to sound so harsh, but he hated goodbyes. He gestured toward the door, and she left. The room felt emptier, colder without her in it. He stared at the door long after she was gone, her final look seared into his memory. He didn't know what it meant, what it should have meant. But he couldn't think about it now. There was work to be done. He turned back to the map of Lakeview, his mind already on Thomas, on finishing what they had started. He would end this, one way or another. It couldn't get worse. Or could it? Jessie's first steps as a free woman felt foreign to her. She almost didn't recognize the world around her, the crispness of the air, the way the wind kissed her skin. The wilderness stretched out before her like an open book, waiting for her to write her own story on its blank pages. She wasn't Rex's girl anymore. She wasn't Theo's pawn. She was Jessie Bauer, and she could go anywhere. That first night, though, was the hardest. The freedom she had longed for now felt like a weight, pressing down on her as she huddled under the stars. She had refused to light a fire for fear of drawing attention, but now she regretted it. The cold seeped into her bones, and the sounds of animals moving in the dark made her grip the gun Theo had given her a little tighter. She still hadn't decided what to do. Should she go back to her family? The people who had abandoned her, forgotten her? Or should she forge ahead into the unknown, free at last but utterly alone? She didn't sleep that night, her thoughts spinning in endless circles. She thought of Theo, of his cold, emotionless face when he had told her to leave. He had dismissed her like she was nothing, like she had never meant anything to him. But deep down, she knew better. There had been something between them, something real. He had been too afraid to admit it, and she had been too afraid to fight for it. The next morning, the decision came to her like a flash of clarity. She would find her family. She would find Thomas Bauer. She hated the man, but she needed answers. She needed closure. She needed to know why her brother had shot her. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled photo of her family that she had taken from Theo's room. Her fingers traced the faces, the memories of a time long past flooding her mind. She hated him, but she couldn't deny that Thomas was a part of her story. He was her blood. She would find him. The journey to find her family took longer than she had expected. The days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion, hunger, and fear. But finally, she found them. Her family, if they could still be called that. They threw her in a cell the moment she arrived. She had expected as much. They didn't trust her. How could they, after everything that had happened? After all, she had been with Theo. She had been his. Or at least, that's what they thought. For a week, she sat in that cell, listening to the arguments outside her door. Thomas, her father, her mother, they all argued over her fate. They didn't know what to do with her, didn't know if they could trust her. Nina was the only one who treated her like a person. A fierce woman with sharp eyes and a softer side she didn't show often. Nina had been the one to bring Jesse a blanket and a mattress. Small kindnesses, but they meant the world to someone who had spent most of her life being treated as nothing more than an object. One day, Nina didn't show up, and Jesse felt a pit form in her stomach. Something was wrong. She could hear her mother's voice, sharp and angry, rising above the others. "I lost Timothy, I lost Adrian, and now I'm left with her, Waters." Jesse couldn't breathe. She pressed herself against the wall, her fists clenched at her sides. Adrian. What happened to Adrian? Nina appeared suddenly, unlocking the door to Jesse's cell. Jesse's heart pounded in her chest as she looked at her friend, desperate for answers, but Nina's eyes were filled with sorrow. Adrian's gone. Gone. The word echoed in Jesse's mind. Adrian, her brother, the one who had shot her. She had tried to hate him, tried to forget him, but deep down he had always been a part of her. Jessie collapsed against the wall, the weight of the news crashing over her like a tidal wave. She had been lying to herself, pretending that it didn't matter, that he didn't matter. But now she would never know why he had done it, why he had pulled that trigger, and that truth would haunt her forever. Several more days passed in that cell. Jessie's rage festered, growing inside her like a living thing. She hated herself for coming back, for hoping that her family would welcome her with open arms. They didn't want her. They didn't trust her. She was nothing to them, just as she had been nothing to Theo in the end. Finally, she had had enough. "Let me out!" she shouted, banging her fists against the door. "For the 100th time, I'm not a spy!" The door creaked open, and to her surprise, it wasn't her mother who stood there but Thomas. He looked older, more haggard than she remembered. The years had not been kind to him. "Hi," he said awkwardly, as if unsure of what to say. Jessie crossed her arms, refusing to give him an inch. "You know why I'm here?" He nodded, his eyes dropping to the floor. "Your mother, she doesn't trust you. She thinks—" "I know what she thinks," Jessie snapped. "She thinks I'm to blame for everything." Thomas sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Adrian told me a lot about you. He didn't mean to shoot you." "I don't care," Jessie said coldly. "He's dead, I get it. Now let me go." Thomas hesitated, his eyes searching her face for some sign of what she wanted. "We're your family, Jessie. You belong here." "In a cell?" She laughed bitterly. "Some family reunion." Nina stepped in, her hand on Thomas's arm. "Thomas, let her go. I'll vouch for her. She's not a spy." Thomas looked at her, his gaze hard and calculating. It reminded Jessie of Theo, of the way he could size someone up with just a glance. "Why did you leave Waters?" Jessie met his gaze, her jaw clenched. "He told me to leave. I think he was using me as bait, but he changed his mind." Thomas's expression softened slightly. "He let you go?" "Yes," Jessie said quietly. "I think he cared about me, in his own way." Thomas's eyes darkened, but he didn't push the subject. "I've been summoned to Lakeview. He wants me to come alone." "He won't kill you," Jessie said softly. "Not after what happened." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You think so?" "I know so." Jessie handed him the crumpled photo she had taken from Theo's room. Thomas unfolded it, a grunt of recognition escaping him. It was in his bedside table. Thomas looked at the picture, then back at her. For the first time, he seemed to really see her, not as a potential threat, but as his daughter. They were family, whether they liked it or not. The journey back to White Hill was long and filled with uncertainty. Jessie traveled with Thomas and Nina, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Theo. She had left him behind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that their story wasn't over. Not yet. When they finally arrived, the camp was quiet, the tension thick in the air. Thomas's soldiers eyed her warily, but no one said a word. "He wants me to go alone," Thomas said, his voice low. Jessie shook her head. "I don't think he'll kill you, Thomas. He's too far gone for that." Thomas shot her a look, his eyes dark and grim. Jessie met his gaze without flinching. She had learned a lot from Theo. She had learned how to survive, how to fight. She wasn't afraid anymore. She dug the picture out of her pocket and handed it to Thomas. He unfolded it carefully, studying the faces in the photograph. "He's still in there somewhere," Jessie said quietly. "The man you knew. He hasn't completely disappeared." Thomas didn't respond, but Jessie could see the doubt in his eyes. Theo was a part of their past, just like she was, and the past had a way of catching up with them. It was years before Jessie could finally make sense of it all, of Theo, of Thomas, of the tangled mess of emotions and history that had brought them all together. After Lakeview, the conflict between the elective and the rebels escalated. Bombs were dropped on major cities and Theo disappeared. No one saw him again. But Jessie saw him. Every night in her dreams, he was there, haunting her. She tried to move on, tried to build a life for herself, but Theo was always there, lurking in the corners of her mind. She had her share of lovers, but none of them lasted. They were never enough, and eventually, she would leave them behind. She had learned how to be alone, how to survive on her own. Years later, she found herself back in Vegas, chasing a bounty that had long since disappeared. She wandered the streets, losing herself in the noise and chaos of the city, trying to forget who she was, where she had come from. But even here, Theo found her. The hand on her shoulder was firm, but gentle. Jessie froze, her knife slipping into her hand instinctively. She spun around, ready to strike, but stopped short when she saw who it was. "Theo," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. He stood before her, older, rougher around the edges, but still Theo. The man she had loved, the man who had broken her heart. She could kill him, she thought. She could end it all right here and finally be free of him. But she didn't. Instead, she slipped her knife back into her boot and stepped back. They stood in silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. "Thomas said you disappeared," she ventured. "I did," Theo said simply. "And you, still with him?" "On and off," Jessie replied, her tone guarded. She wasn't ready to let him back in, not yet. Theo reached out, his fingers grazing hers. Jessie's breath hitched. Even after all these years, his touch still set her on edge. "I stole something from you," Jessie said suddenly, reaching into her pocket and pulling out the crumpled photo. She pressed it into his hand, watching as he unfolded it carefully. Theo stared at the picture, his face unreadable. "Thanks," he said quietly. "I lost everything after the bombs." Jessie nodded. She had lost everything too, but things didn't matter anymore. Objects were just reminders of a past that no longer existed. They went to his apartment, a far cry from the pristine quarters he had once kept. The room was small, cluttered, but Jessie didn't mind. It felt real, like the man who stood before her. Not the general, not the president, just Theo. They drank together, cheap moonshine burning their throats, the silence between them growing more comfortable with each passing moment. For the first time in years, Jessie felt at ease. Sitting shoulder to shoulder on the floor of Theo's apartment, Jessie felt a sense of peace wash over her. It was strange, after all these years, to find herself here, with him. They were no longer the people they had been, but that was okay. They had both grown, both changed. "I forgive you," Jessie said softly, breaking the silence. Theo turned to look at her, his eyes wide with surprise. "You do?" Jessie nodded. "I forgave you a long time ago, for myself, so I could move on." Theo's gaze softened, and for the first time she saw the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago, the man who had tried in his own broken way to save her. The journey back to White Hill would not be easy, but this time they would face it together. And so, Jessica Bauer's journey continues, a tale of forgiveness, survival, and the search for meaning in a world long shattered by war. Can she truly escape her past, or will the shadows of her former life always haunt her? If you were moved by this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more gripping narratives. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Jessica's shoes? Thank you for watching the trilogy of Jessica Bauer, The Untold Reckoning. Until next time, stay safe, stay strong, And remember, sometimes the hardest battle is the one inside your own heart.